In this video, you will discover how these podcasters, Kyle and John, went from 600 monthly downloads to 5,000 plus monthly downloads 7 months later. So look, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListens.com, a company helping entrepreneurs of podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm also the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generates around $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month. Those down there, those are our books under the pen of Daniel Larson. But again, this isn't about me, this is about you. So let's dive straight in. So the main issues that these clients were struggling with when they first joined the Get More Listens Academy is simply, number one, attracting their target audience. Number two, finding the time to focus on the growth of their show. Number three, knowing what actions to take to get a better ROI for the time and money they have already invested into their show. And number four, finding new and effective ways of getting more listeners for their show outside of social media and targeting high-profile guests. All in all is essentially what we hear time and time again about entrepreneurs of podcasts, clients that we work with. They're strapped for time, they want to make an ROI, but they have no idea or no real strategy in place of consistently and reliably getting new listeners. So for them, all this led to slow growth, low engagement, no income generating opportunities from their podcast, and of course, a podcast they love, but they just couldn't keep doing as a hobby. And this is a situation that so many podcasters find themselves in. They have an incredible show, you're totally in love with it, you think it's amazing. However, if you can't get an ROI after 1 year, 2 years, sometimes even 3 years, you start to question, well, why the hell should I even bother with this? Because I'm putting all this time and effort and energy into the show. I'm not making money from it. I'm struggling with slow growth, and my audience are barely engaging with me. So for them, of course, it was super frustrating, and that's kind of why they wanted to explore a different path of growing. These were the main problems we identified once they came on board. Number one, they were focusing on all the wrong things. Their social media promotions efforts just weren't helping them grow at all. And again, we find this time and time again. Most podcasters use social media, even though social media is an effective way to grow. And you've probably experienced this yourself, that you're promoting, but oftentimes it doesn't lead to significant growth of your show. Number two, who their podcast was targeting just wasn't clear at all. So it made it super hard for them to attract the right listeners, let alone paying clients. Now, this is hugely important. If you're an entrepreneur of a podcast and you have a product that you want to sell, you want to use your podcast as a marketing asset, not only to grow and make impact, but to actually generate some clients through your podcast. It's so important that your targeting is clear and specific if you want to attract the right clients. So again, for them, it just wasn't clear and specific. I'm going to go through the exact example in just a moment. And number three, their podcast wasn't optimized for podcast SEO, so they couldn't be found or seen organically on Apple and Spotify. Podcast SEO is a process where you simply ranking your podcast higher on Apple and Spotify for specific keywords. Those are the main platforms new listeners go to discover new shows. So instead of you trying to promote on social media, you can just rank high on Apple and Spotify. However, most podcasts are totally unaware they can actually take specific steps in order to rank your show higher and get more discoverability on Apple and Spotify. John and Kyle, whose case study this is all about, were completely clueless. I'd love to know from your end if it's something you're familiar with. And finally, they didn't have a strong value proposition that was attractive to new listeners on a week-to-week basis. So what changes did we make? I'm going to break this down in painful detail, right? The first thing is we clarified who the show was for. This is the starting point of everything. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do, promoting on social media, targeting high-profile guests, relying on word of mouth. None of that matters unless you have complete clarity on who the podcast is for, number one. But more importantly, because you might know who your show is for. I totally get that. But as another thing, understanding how to position the show and how to package your podcast in order to attract the right listeners you want to listen to the podcast. So for them, we had to package their show as something new and wildly attractive to the listeners they wanted to reach. Their new target audience was high net worth individuals in Canada who are looking to save on taxes and increase their income through unique investment strategies. We then had to clearly communicate who the show was for across different elements of their show. And this is what most podcasters totally ignore. So what were these key elements? Number one, their tagline. The tagline is a statement, a short sentence they say at the start of their actual podcast in order to introduce their podcast, what their podcast is about, and who their show is for. Number two, their show name. Number three, the actual show description. And number four, their content strategy. So these are all the key elements that will either, and this is so important, turn strangers into listeners or repel them. This is the entry point for a new listener who's just discovered your show. The old show name was The Invested Teacher, which is unclear, not specific, and failing to attract the ideal listeners. They were actually attracting, funnily enough, teachers who are beginners looking to get into investing. They named it Investor Teacher because they thought it was a nice pun. They themselves are teachers, then they got into the real estate market, then they got into investing overall. So Investor Teacher is what they went with. But of course, that doesn't attract high net worth individual. So we decided to change the name to the Canadian Wealth Secrets. And you can see the cover changes as well. This was way more clear, SEO friendly because we had Canadian wealth, so it was super targeted, and it was also intriguing. Secrets, Canadian Wealth Secrets. The show is now far more attractive, has more of an authoritative feel, helping them stand out, but also helping them attract the right listeners and clients. So for you right now in your situation, think about what specific changes can you make to your show name and your cover art to actually give yourself more of an authoritative feel, to speak directly to the listeners you want to attract. Because if you're not attracting the right listeners to your show, it's purely because you're not communicating who the show is for clear enough. It can be as simple as knocking down the first domino, which is changing your show name to be more specific and targeted, and that way everything else becomes way easier. Growth, impact, attracting the right people, engaging the right people, all of those things come into play. We then crafted a new show description that spoke again specifically to their listener, their needs, their situation, where they were currently at. Now, the podcast show description is one that most people just set and forget. I feel super confident that you yourself probably have just set and forget your show description. And I don't blame you. It's pretty boring. I say it's boring. You do it so early in your journey that you oftentimes just completely forget. Here's the thing. The show description is also one of the key components a new listener will look at when deciding or considering whether or not your show is worth listening to. So this is an opportunity that you can use to essentially sell your show, to talk about the value of your show, to talk about why people should listen and why they can't afford not to listen. But that's often overlooked by both new and experienced podcasters who essentially set and forget the description. And then they lose out on this opportunity to actually connect and convert more strangers into listeners. And again, Carl and John, they were the exact same. They kind of missed the opportunity before until we changed things up. So this is the exact framework that we use to help them communicate who their show is for and attract more of the right listeners when it came to their show description. Number one, we start with a strong hook. So call out your audience and grab their attention. Number two, add a short podcast origin story. The whole point here is to build a bit of trust, build some connection with your new listeners. You really want to give them a reason to care. Number three, share your podcast mission. So clarify why your show exists in the first place and give people a reason to actually care. Number four, state exactly what listeners will gain from listening to your show. Literally have 3 key benefits they're going to gain from listening to your show. It could be find out secret tax strategies your accountants wouldn't believe are true. Number 2, access to experts who are going to talk about specific new investment opportunities within the Canadian real estate market. And number 3, how best to multiply your wealth and create a legacy for your family. Again, these are just random examples from the top of my dome. The point here is it needs to be something that's beneficial to your audience. This is all about your listeners, not yourself. So make it about them. And then finally, end with an incentive-based call to action. Now, what this will do is essentially remove resistance from someone who's new, who doesn't know you yet, to actually go on and listen to your podcast. And when you share a fan favorite episode, a little psychological trick here, I like my psychology. A little trick here is by saying fan favorite episode, we're adding social proof and almost letting them know that this is a good episode. Now, for this one, what you want to do is make sure the one you recommend is actually the episode that's not the highest downloaded, but the episode that has the highest retention time, which is the completion rate of the episode. And what this will do is we know that our goal is to engage them, to provide them high quality content they'll absolutely love. And whilst you might have an episode with 1,000 downloads per episode, but if it has a low retention time, the perceived value of that episode is far lower. Whereas if you have an episode that has maybe less listeners, less listens, but has 100% retention time on average, we know that that's validation that your audience love that episode and they engage with it massively. And we want their first sample, this new listener, we want their first sample and their first taste of your podcast to be something that they're going to be highly engaged with. And remember, new listeners don't know you yet. They simply don't care. So you have to sell the listen to your podcast and convince them to take that first step and listen. And that's exactly what we do with our show description. So from there, we then change their tagline to speak direct to the listeners they wanted to reach. So your tagline, like I mentioned before, is a single sentence you say at the start of your episode to help new listeners decide whether your podcast is right for them or not. So for John and Carl, we made it. And by the way, again, this is a spoken thing that goes at the start of your intro. So for Carl and John, it was welcome to the Canadian Wealth Secrets, the podcast helping entrepreneurs, business owners, and investors grow their wealth into a legacy that lasts generation through hidden investment and tax secrets your financial advisors listeners won't believe are true. And again, clarifies who the show is for, what topics they're going to be focused on, why people should listen, the secrets, while making their show feel super intriguing and exciting, right? So if you hear that and you're the target demographic, you're going to be far more likely to then engage and listen all the way through to the podcast. This is so important that we have the alignment across everything. I keep going back to this. We need to constantly clarify who the show is for and talk to them with our podcast through different elements: the show name, the cover art, the show description, the actual spoken tagline. Because new listeners don't know you yet and they simply don't care. You have to sell your podcast and convince them to take that first step and listen to your show. So after we clarified who their show's for, we then went on to helping them rank higher on Apple and Spotify through data-driven podcast SEO. Essentially, so most podcasters, they believe that podcast SEO was just way too complicated, only for experts, and takes way too long to see effects. Now, I get this. I generally felt the exact same as well. But then I met this guy called Jake Wall, an incredible guy, does a phenomenal job when it comes to SEO. And he was able to grow his podcast to 300,000 monthly downloads strictly, and that's per month in 7 months, strictly with podcast SEO. Once I found this, my mom was honestly blown and I was pretty pissed off. I'm not going to lie, because I was like, how the hell is this guy able to get such insane results? So I thought, you know what, let me figure out how we can do this for our clients as well. So again, I used to think it was going to be overwhelming, too complicated, only for the experts. But honestly, you just need to understand the basics of podcast SEO, not normal SEO, which is all about Google, etc. So in other words, most podcasters totally overlook the power of podcast SEO as a growth strategy, which is a huge mistake. This made it hard for them, John and Carl, to be found organically. And if you're not optimized for podcast SEO right now, things will be so much harder for you as well, because again, you're fighting an uphill battle. This is the platform where the listeners you want to reach are literally at. So how much easier would it be for you to actually be found by the listeners who are actively searching for your content? But when you aren't on podcast SEO, or when you aren't optimized rather for podcast SEO, and you're not ranking for highly searched keywords, it's so much harder to find your podcast. So for Carl and John, this had to change if we wanted their growth and engagement to move in the right direction without us just relying on social media promotion, getting high profile guests, which again rarely actually works. So for them, we ranked higher for highly searched keywords. We increased their episode completion rate so the algorithm pushes their content to new listeners. So essentially what we did was we introduced like stronger hooks at the start of their intros, added 3 benefits listeners will gain. And by doing this, we were able to incentivize more of their listeners to engage all the way through to the end of their episode. Because Apple and Spotify, I wish I could sit here and say like, oh look, all you have to do for podcast SEO is add in a bunch of keywords and you absolutely sell. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Apple and Spotify, they're not going to get duped by a young black British guy who's helping their clients simply by adding specific keywords. For them, Apple and Spotify, their goal is to keep users on their platform. So if your podcast episode has a high engagement rate and you can keep users on their platform, they're going to recommend your show a lot more, right? So again, it's really important to have this high completion rate. And it's good regardless, because if you're trying to generate income from your podcast, you need to have a high completion rate in order to build the like, know, and trust of your clients regardless anyways, right? Number 3, we got them a brand new cover art. And people might think, what does a cover have to do with bloody, podcast SEO? But think about it, right? Yes, you're being discovered for the right keywords. Let's say you're ranking for, wealth or investing in Canada. It's also you versus everyone else within your industry. So other people will try to target these keywords, and oftentimes just because you're being discovered, it doesn't mean you're being seen and clicked on over competition. Like if you've got a terrible cover art and you are on page 1 and everyone else's cover art is better than yours, great, you're being technically discovered. But if you're not being clicked on over the competition, then why the hell? It's just a waste of time and effort, right? So their cover art needed to change as well. And that was more so to help them stand out, to attract the right listeners, and to convert more eyeballs into listeners. And finally, we included highly searched keywords we wanted their show to rank for. We did this in their show notes, and their episode titles, through their show name, and through their description, like I've already mentioned. And this again gives Apple and Spotify way more data in terms of what keywords to rank their show for. And there's actually an email that Carl got, which essentially just said like, hey, they're now actually being listed on one of the best financial podcasts out there within Canada for listeners. So again, a little awesome thing that's going to happen. And then of course, they had another email as well, which essentially just let them know, hey, I found you by listening to your podcast. I stumbled across it, quote unquote, on Apple Podcasts. But here's the thing when it comes to podcast SEO. Number 1, it's super straightforward once you have an actual process. Number 2, is effective basically instantly, and you'll see an increase in downloads depending which keyword you're trying to rank for. Number 3, it's simple. You just need to focus on the basics. Don't try to overcomplicate things, because it really isn't that complicated. It's just knowing the process to follow. And number 4 is effective and has generated our clients hundreds of thousands of extra downloads over the last 3.5 years. I genuinely mean that. So it's immensely powerful. There's really 4 paths that we follow through when it comes to podcast SEO: discoverability, ranking for highly searched keywords; visibility, being seen and clicked on over the competition. That's your show name, your episode titles, your show notes. They have to sell the listen to convert that eyeball into a listener. Number 3, the completion rate, increasing your completion time, making sure your retention time is above 80% consistently. And number 4, building relevancy. So this is more of a long-term approach where we're really thinking about multiple keywords we want you to rank your show for. So for you, think about what are the main keywords your audience was searching on Apple and Spotify to discover your podcast. How can you start ranking for those keywords? So by making these changes, we were able to increase the number of ways new listeners found their podcast organically, which of course helps massively when it comes to attracting, engaging, and retaining more of the right listeners. So at this point, they're turning more strangers into listeners by clarifying who this show's for. Their podcast is being found each day by new listeners on Apple and Spotify through podcast SEO. And their podcast is getting those listeners coming back for more because we built out like a content strategy for them as well. So again, the content strategy is simply like the topics that focus on helping the target audience, which were high net worth individuals in Canada looking for investment and tax saving secrets to help them essentially preserve and grow their wealth. Now it's all about getting an absurd amount of exposure for their show because again, it's proven to turn strangers to listeners, get those listeners coming back for more, and being found organically. So at this point, just getting exposure makes total sense. So here's why we decided to focus on guesting as our exposure strategy for their show. Number 1, guesting on other podcasts is your shortcut to a wider listener base. Number 2, guest appearances deliver faster results than just relying on your show's guests to attract new listeners. So a lot of people will invite high-profile guests on in hopes that they will bring their audience into the podcast. But of course, the spotlight is on the guest, and the audience that they've brought are coming for the guest. So it's really important that we can flip the script with guesting on other people's podcasts because the spotlight is on us. And if the podcast that I'm being a guest on, if their listener base and audience really resonate with my message and my tonality, guess what they're going to do? They're going to check out my podcast. Number 3, each podcast has a unique set of audience. So this is your way of essentially constantly exposing yourself to new listeners who are active podcast listeners. And when you're guesting on a bunch of different shows over a year, the more shows you guest on, the more discovery points you create to drive more growth for your podcast, because essentially you're creating discovery points across all of these different podcasts for their listeners to discover your show. Super powerful stuff. It's very straightforward, very simple. And that's what we decided to do. So for John and Carl, they featured on major shows within their niche. They were being exposed to thousands of new listeners each month while building their authority network in the process, which is again a massive bonus. For us, what we do, we essentially remove the guesswork for our clients. So we find, vet, and qualify the shows they want to be featured on, and we then help them create high converting pitching templates that get positive responses and bookings. So let's recap. Number 1, we made their show wildly attractive to listeners they wanted to reach. Number 2, we built a content strategy to keep their listeners coming back for more. Number 3, we increased the discoverability of their show so that new listeners found them organically. And number 4, we built them an exposure strategy to target only the listeners they actually wanted to reach. And that's how we got these amazing results. The only possible outcome from these changes were, number 1, a podcast that finally broke past slow and steady growth. Number 2, a podcast that not only attracts the right listeners, but helps them generate highly qualified leads for their business. Number 3, a podcast that's climbing the ranks on Apple and Spotify that they genuinely feel proud of. A positive ROI show that gives way more than it takes. So look, there you have it. That's how Carl and John were able to go from 600 downloads per month to 5,000 monthly downloads 7 months later. If you enjoyed this, feel free to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.